Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock-flavoured podcast. On the show, Miles is back to carry on trenching through the coming of the Terraphiles and see if we can avoid getting sidetracked by our love of all things Who. Spoiler, we can't. So, sit back, decide which Tom Baker you are today, and join us in the cloister room as we explore how the universe of Doctor Who melds with the multiverse of Michael Moorcock. Miles explains the Timeless Child arc, and we discover just what Freddy / Frank Force and the Antimatter Men are after. We are back in Derry and Tom's after the cloister bell came down on us last time and cut us short. So it'll be really, really interesting to see whether we get through the actual coming of the Terraphiles in this session, or whether something gets in the way again. But you know what? It doesn't really matter, does it? If we do this in 10 parts, I don't care, because it's always a good laugh talking to you, Miles. So yes, welcome back to Derry and Tom's as we pick up Coming to the Terraphiles Part 2.
Thank you much, Andy. Always a pleasure to be here.
Good. You just mentioned that you're on the old Rosie Lee this evening, which I think is...
Yup, I am usually a coffee drinker, but sometimes when I feel like I've been overdoing coffee a bit too much, I decide to get myself a box or two of nice black tea, just to be more of a stereotype than I already appear to be in the eyes of my friends and co-workers.
Yeah, I think that's fine. In fact, I've just put one out myself, a delicious cup of Yorkshire tea. But for this evening, it being a school night, I'm not going crazy. So I've just had a look at what we had kicking around, and I've got a bottle of Hatherwood Porter, dark, sleek and malted. And it seems to have the silhouette of like a panther on the label, which is apt because, you know, I have the grace and agility of a panther. So I'm going to drink something with a panther on it, because that's how I roll. So yes, we are back to touch on the coming of the Terraphiles, I'm sure. We continue our broad, rambling discussion about all things Doctor Who and Moorcock's take on it. So, something I forgot to touch on in part 1. You've written Doctor Who stories.
I have. It's for a fan group called the Doctor Who Project, and it's always kind of fun sometimes. You know, it helps me kind of when I'm sort of struggling with my actual writing, or just wanting to kind of try something new. It's always kind of fun, even if the final quality isn't always the best.
So, how many have you written?
5. I actually finished writing one earlier this year, which should be out eventually, and a lot of fun to write. Very kind of, I would say, Roger Corman-esque, doing Vincent, doing Edgar Allan Poe.
I do remember linking to him 2 or 3 years ago when I did promote what the patrons were up to. I think I mentioned the webpage, but just refresh my memory and refresh the listeners' memories. Where can they find them?
I believe it's the Doctor Who Project, all one word, .com.
Now, when it comes to writing IP fiction, which we've already discussed, of course, when we talked about Alien and Aliens, and we talked about those kind of key pillars and the key beats and features that make a property what it is. What are the key things for you with not only reading a Doctor Who book or novel, but actually writing a Doctor Who tale? What are the pillars of the IP that you found yourself rigorously needing to adhere to?
Honestly, I would say the one great thing about Doctor Who is that you could, for pretty much, you can just go, you can do anything. That's the kind of thing I enjoy, I like about when I write Doctor Who fan fiction. It's like, you can write something set in 1970s London, or have it be like on a spaceship in the far future. There are very few rules as long as you adhere to just the character and his sensibilities. You can really much do whatever you like in whatever situation he's in. You put him in. Like that's kind of like the really freeing part about Doctor Who, and honestly, kind of each of the stories I've done has been I wanted to kind of do something different or push kind of something I wanted to work on. It's quite funny. I always keep saying to myself, all right, I'm going to do something more traditional, have like 2 corridors and have like some running up and down. it starts with that intention, and that intention gets chucked out of the window because I'm one of those writers who just loves to have characters just talk and talk and talk, and it's just like, no, less talking, more running. No, like, no, oh god, I'm being subject. No subtext. Cowards work. This is Doctor Who. You've got to have something jump out like every 20 pages or so. You got to hit that beat, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were trying to summarize what you need in a Doctor Who story, just from classic Who, even of the space of that time, there might be some mild variation, but the whole running for 30% of the story with Murray Gold music behind it is very much a modern confection. Obviously with the originals, I suppose if you were to think about what are the key things you must have in a Doctor Who story, cliffhangers. When it comes to classic Doctor Who, it's cliffhangers, sometimes really tenuous and poorly constructed cliffhangers that aren't really cliffhangers at all. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we're reading this Moorcock Doctor Who novel, and one of the key pillars of Who in terms of, I don't know, not just the concept and the structure of it all, is something like the TARDIS, the technology, which very, very little of that in the coming of the Terraphiles. Most of the time, the TARDIS is simply hidden away somewhere because the Doctor is paranoid that the forces of antimatter or chaos, or Freddy Force and the antimatter men, might be after it. And it's very much, I think, one of the pleasant surprises for me about the coming of the Terraphiles is how it doesn't stick to the beats of what most people would expect a Doctor Who novel to be, which is probably why I like it so much. And we'll get into some of the details on that. But yeah, I mean, some of the other ones I've read are too slavish to the whole idea of Doctor Who, whereas this, I just really enjoy it. Not just because it's Moorcock and it's got lots of throwaway, interesting ideas, almost Robert Sheckley style in places, some of the things, and we'll touch on some of those as we go along. It's a very different Doctor Who experience, yet somehow he manages to capture the voice of the Matt Smith Doctor and Amy really quite effectively, I think. Whenever I read the Doctor's dialogue, I always read it in my head in Matt Smith's voice.
Which is, quite impressive, because I would say that Matt Smith is a very difficult Doctor to kind of nail down, because it's one of those ones where it's very much in Matt Smith's mannerisms and performance. It's not like Tennant, which I feel like the Tennant kind of era Doctor, you can get on the page pretty easily, because a lot of it is all there. It's all, dashing, handsome, and then just kind of just turn around and be utterly brooding.
Yeah.
Where I feel like Matt Smith's performance really does shift from episode to episode, just depending on the Doctor's mood, which I think the book does get.
Tennant for me was gurning, brooding, with not a whole lot in between. I think to some degree we've got a similar problem with the way that the new Doctor is being written. He's giggling inanely and running around like he's on uppers, or he's crying, and there's no real in between.
No,
I would love some in between. Please give us some in between.
Yeah, unfortunately, since we've been stuck with just 8 episodes, you feel like where you'd get the in between, we've unfortunately kind of lost you to scheduling.
Yeah, it's a real problem. Been a real problem for this series, I think. So we should point out we're recording this 2 or 3 days after the season finale of the 2024 season of Doctor Who concluded. And we'll maybe talk about that a little bit further down the line, because we have to, don't we? It's 2 or 3. What is it? It's Monday, isn't it? So
it's Monday.
It's only 2 days old, almost to the hour. I've not quite recovered from the disappointment, I have to say.
Yeah, I when I was watching it afterwards, I kind of turned to my wife and said, "Yep, that was a Russell T Davies season finale, for better or for worse." Which is the set, like the setup of part 1, getting all the pieces in position for part 1 is fantastic, amazing, and then it just kind of never really comes together. And I'm sure with more subsequent viewings, I will find the connective tissue which I didn't pick up in the first watch. But it's, as season finales go, it's not been one of my favorites.
No, it's to be honest, it's, you know what, let's go there now. In general, in terms of the series, I was kind of 50-50 on this series. I like Ncuti. I think he's got charisma to burn. I think the problem is I'm not entirely convinced that I like him as the Doctor for the reason that I just said, because he only seems to have two modes. This is entirely down to the writing. I don't think this is down to him at all. He has running out of the TARDIS with the constant energy and the giggling, and then he has silently stoic with a tear streaming down his face or screaming with rage and agony, and there's not a whole lot in between. But when it was good, I thought it was great. It featured some really interesting stories. I really liked the Black Mirror-esque one, which did kind of gradually show its hand as it went along, but it's one of those where you could rewatch it and the signs are a lot more evident.
Oh, yeah.
I enjoyed that one. I thought it was good. I enjoyed the ending. I always enjoy the ones where, to some degree, the Doctor and the companion aren't the centre of the story, but they're there for the punchline, effectively. There was a David Tennant one, I think, where they only appeared on a TV screen for the bulk.
Was that Blink?
No, I can't remember what it's called, but it was anyway, it was an interesting story. I don't think it was entirely successful, but I liked the idea that the actual story was taking place and they were only like almost tangentially involved for a protracted period of time until it comes through in the end. So when it was good, it was really good. I thought the first episode of the season finale was good, although I'm kicking myself for getting sucked in by it because I should have known what was coming.
Yep.
But nevertheless, it did fan service for the modern fans, and it did fan service for the original fans, and it sent me running off to watch Pyramids of Mars like probably 200,000 other people.
At the same time, isn't it better to just be able to just watch something and you kind of know what you're setting yourself up for? But just I feel like a lot of people these days, we're all kind of very much self-aware of how the sausage is made. And isn't it just kind of just nice to kind of get caught up in the magic of the story and not just go, could be better.
Well, I think I would be quite happy to get caught up in that and then watch the second one and think, oh, well, it wasn't as good as the first one. It was a bit of a damp squib. But I thought the second one was actually really, really super terrible on almost every level. It was a Russell T Davies bait and switch. It was lazy, glib, nonsensical, and really, really smug, I thought. Particularly the bit where it practically tells the audience not to be stupid for expecting something interesting around the resolution, which I thought was, a little bit much. And I should have expected it, but it is what it is. It is what it is. But it reminded me of a South Park episode when everybody's getting high, smelling their own farts. And that season finale was Russell T Davies high on his own farts.
Yeah.
While he was writing that. And I didn't like the CGI Jackal in the first episode, but the CGI Jackal being dragged through space through the time, it was just awful. It looked terrible. It was ridiculous. But, at least I enjoyed the first one.
Yeah. I'd say in terms of this season, I think the Black Mirror one and the Stephen Moffat one where the Doctor's stuck on a landmine for the whole episodes were probably my standouts.
I quite liked 73 Yards as well, even though
that was a fun one.
It had the inevitable, by the end everything will reset. The moment she started to age, it was just like, oh, right, okay. So this is going to be a big reset at the end, which is always disappointing. And actually, you got that in the finale, didn't you? Where 10 minutes into the episode, everybody's turning to dust, and you're like, oh, right. So it doesn't really matter now because everything's going to get reset at the end. So all the peril is completely dispelled. And, but at least he got a spoon off some woman on some planet, which actually that scene was the best scene for me in the entire episode. And I would much rather 40 of the 45 minutes have been scenes like that, because I think when it eases off a little bit and allows itself to be, even for a moment, slightly thoughtful, it's great. I really, really like it. I was chatting to my mate Rich about this after the finale. He messaged me, he said, and I quote, he said, A recurring plotline shouldn't just be words or mysterious characters. That's when the plotline becomes, what's the story? Like in Picard seasons 1 and 2. And he says,
Ouch.
Also, prophecies, dreams, and visions should be banned. Bad Wolf, Saxon, the Bees, Trenzalore, the Doctor's Name, the Timeless Child, the Lonely Cyberman. Prophecies are recurring words pretending to be plots.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't feel, for the most part, that like Doctor Who should be a story which has season-wide arcs. Or for the most part, I feel like, okay, you've got the key to time in the Fourth Doctor, or the Black Guardian trilogy, which is my personal favorite of the Fifth Doctor era, an era I'm not particularly a fan of. But admittedly, that is one of the few times the Fifth Doctor era goes into that weird sci-fi, like with the Terminus, which looks terrible, but just the strange concepts of like a leper colony on a space station at the center of the universe. It is just that's that high concept gold I love in my Doctor Who.
I was thinking about this Doctor Who cosmology stuff because we'll get to it, but there's a chapter in here where we get a combination of Woodhouseian farce and descriptions of the multiverse cosmology from the perspective of the Doctor Who universe, which is terrific, and we'll look at that, probably read a little bit of that later on. But when it comes to cosmologies, you're right, Doctor Who had some really interesting stabs, and the key to time, actually, that was the first ever season-long arc of connected stories with a bridging framework, with a framing device, wasn't it? Doctor Who had never done that before, and it didn't do it again until you had the Black Guardian trilogy, but that was maybe half of a season. And there were a couple of interesting efforts that, I don't think it was cosmological, but was it Kinder and Snake Dance? They were connected in some way, weren't they?
Yeah, because they're both Damara, and then you had some kind of connecting tissue in the last few Sylvester McCoy seasons with Ace, but it's not. It's funny watching like where the show is ending, and you can actually see the bits which are going to be built up on in the modern era of the show. But it's not as pronounced. So you have Ace's, you have Ace's troubled background as like an 80s teen, and then you find out that she's actually caught up in this mysterious old Lovecraftian god malarkey, which no one was aware of until it gets revealed.
Oh, interesting.
With the Curse of Fenric.
Right, okay. I think I might have seen... Was the Curse of Fenric the one set on the coast on a military base or something?
Yes, with the Enigma machine.
Yeah, I do dimly remember watching... I never watched the whole thing, but I do dimly remember there being a very Shadow over Innsmouth kind of angle to that with people coming from the sea or something. But
they're like weird vampires who are actually what mankind will evolve to in the future, in like the polluted future of the Earth,
right?
But just brought back in time. And also Nicholas Parsons from Just a Minute, plays a priest who is losing his faith because the war is going on, and he's feeling morally conflicted by British bombs blowing up German children.
Yeah,
which is a quite surprising twist for a 1989 Doctor Who. But then again, it's Andrew Cartmel who did try to bring down Thatcher with the Happiness Patrol a year earlier,
which again had a surprising casting. Doctor Who really went through a period of odd casting, stunt casting almost, didn't it? That was Richard Briers, I think, wasn't it? Hale and Pace were in one, for fuck's sake.
That's Richard Briers' Paradise Towers. It's Sheila Hancock in Happiness Patrol playing neon pink Thatcher.
Right, I don't think I ever saw that one. I think I probably turned on the Richard Briers one once and watched 5 minutes of it and turned it straight off again as a key error.
There is one with Ken Dodd.
Oh God.
Enough said.
Yeah. I remember Hale and Pace being in one and just thinking, holy fuck, 10 over, God. Yeah, so they've had a go at some of the cosmology stuff. I mean, the Key to Time series is an interesting one, isn't it? For people's sake of people's memories, I should say. That was the season with the first Romana, the dark-haired Romana, played by Mary Tam. And I can't honestly remember what the deal with the Black and White Guardian was or what the arc was, but I do remember enjoying most of the stories, particularly the Stones of Blood, which is probably one of my favourites. And that 73 yards, when that kicked off, I was getting a bit of a Stones of Blood, like folk horror kind of vibe from that. But unfortunately, what it lacked was that brilliant old professor woman from the Stones of Blood, who was worth the price of entry alone. What was the Black and White Guardian arc about?
There is this MacGuffin, the key to time, which is split into 6 parts in 6 separate time zones, and the White Guardian, who is representing good and we can. This is a more podcast, so we could probably say like Law and Order. Gets the Doctor to find the 6 parts of the key to time through the 6. The really good thing about the key to time is that the item itself is just like tangential to the story. So I think in one episode, the androids of Tara, they find it immediately as part of a statue, but then Romana immediately gets kidnapped, and then you've got like swashbuckling shenanigans with robots, and then you have the Black Guardian, who is evil and thus chaotic. And it turns out it wasn't the White Guardian who had got the Doctor to pick up the keys. The Black Guardian disguised himself as the White Guardian, and then got the Doctor to basically do a huge fetch quest so he could get the key to time, so the Black Guardian can take control of the universe.
It is very Moorcockian, isn't it? Because it is a series of fetch quests for mystical artifacts. And I do remember enjoying it all. I can't remember if it was DVD or VHS, but I got a box set of it back in the day, and me and Firthy, we sat and watched them all. And I don't think I've ever managed to get through the Armageddon Factor without falling asleep. So I don't think I've ever seen it all the way through. Time and again, I've tried to watch the finale, the 6-episode finale. Maybe that's the problem, because it was 6 episodes long. It was just too much.
And it's at that moment when, like, I think inflation had hit so much that Doctor Who just had no money. So they're trying to do like big concept ideas, but it's like, nope, we have more money than we did for Underworld, which means nothing because they had no money for Underworld.
Yeah,
it's quite funny. Like when I first started dating my wife, this was a year before New Who came back, and I wanted to show her Doctor Who, but all they had was like the Pirate Planet. I'm like, oh god, I can't show my wife this. I can't show Rihanna this. It looks so cheap and silly. I want to show her something like Pyramids of Mars or the Ark in Space. And then she watched it and she's like, this is by Douglas Adams. I'm like, yeah, why did you think I wouldn't like this? I love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm like, you're right, I'm stupid.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I actually think one of the biggest problems for this latest series was sending so many people to the Pyramids of Mars. Because after watching the Pyramids of Mars, which, okay, the 4th episode isn't amazing. The Pyramids of Mars doesn't really stick the landing that convincingly.
No.
Because the last episode, where they're just working their way through this pyramid on Mars through rooms of... it's pretty lame. But, the payoff's okay. They cast Sutek off down the time vortex or whatever it is. It's pretty good. But the first 3 episodes are so good.
Yeah.
They are so good. It's dark, it's sinister, it's weird. And Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen are on fire. Their chemistry is incredible. And it really is a spectacularly good example of classic Who, I think. It's as good as it gets, really. Even if they don't quite stick the landing. Yeah.
But it's also it's like with Doctor Who, it's like how many stories are like, this has a great image and maybe like a great episode 2 cliffhanger, but then it just kind of that never really truly sticks the landing.
Interestingly, we were talking about Underworld messaging a couple of weeks ago, weren't we? And I watched Underworld as you did, and it is pretty bad. It's not as bad as its reputation suggests, I don't think, but it really struggles because of those terrible special effects. Tom Baker plainly can't be arsed. As brilliant as he is in the Pyramids of Mars, by the time, I don't know if it's the season or the story, he doesn't give a flying fuck. in that episode. He's not even... Other actors around him are reacting to things, and he's just stood there looking bored as shit. But what carries that story for me is Alan Lake. The performance of Alan Lake is absolutely brilliant. He's got the crazy hair. He's given it absolutely everything, right to from episode 1 to episode 4. And I've always liked Alan Lake, and he was an interesting character himself, and married to Diana Dawes for a while.
Oh,
yeah, and he was
wow.
he was a hardcore drinker, as was Diana Dawes towards the end, and they were, I think it's fair to say, they were pretty bad for each other. But whenever he acted, and he would do a lot of genre TV. He was in Blake 7. He did Doctor Who, and he would really, really give it absolutely everything. He was a proper pro, and he would act with total gusto. I do wonder if him and Tom Baker would end up getting on the lash in Soho afterwards, or whether he was even part of that crowd. But yeah, Alan Lake makes that story for me. But anyway, we're nearly half an hour in, and we haven't started on this fucking book. So right, let's get back to where we were.
Okay.
Yeah, thinking about this book, we talked about it towards the end of the last episode. We've got the setup. The Doctor is actually, it kicks off with the pirate Captain Cornelius, who we found out is setting out to find the Doctor, and the Doctor and Amy found themselves on a planet in the far future playing Whack-It with Jadoon and six-legged dogs and lots of 20th century obsessed extreme cosplayers. We met Mr. and Mrs. Banning Cannon and their daughter Flapper, her doting suitor Harry Agincourt, and some other characters like Bingo Loxley, the Lord of Loxley. And we learn a little bit more about the games being held by the toxophilic Terraphiles and the Banning Cannon's place within that group, because they own Terraformer, a company that terraforms planets into Earth-like worlds with historical, mostly sporting themes. And for these games, the final of which will take place on the planet Migia. Well, Migia, there's a deep, deep Mocock cut there.
Isn't that from the Standard Worlds / the Blood Red game?
It's from all sorts of things, including being the name of one of the Lords of Law, or Ladies of, I can't remember, but it's a recurring name. The grand prize is a silver arrow of Artemis, an ancient artifact that to this community might as well be as valuable as a Fabergé egg or a venerable and antique piece of Retina's tat. It's further described in a later chapter as the mythical Staff of Law, as owned by the Lord of the BBC of Old Barsoom. BBC being BEE of Old Barsoom. Barsoom gets a couple of mentions because, of course, Mocock, he loves him a bit of Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Yep.
And Mrs. Banning Cannon has been asked, as a wealthy aristocrat, to present the prize to the winners. I'm just going to read a little bit. Unknown to her husband and daughter, Mrs. Banning Cannon had proposed this galactic nostalgia to her precisely because she felt the old urge rising in her, threatening to burst the bonds she had mentally cast around it. Only moments before the decision to embark on this educational luxury cruise, whilst despairing over her daughter's prospects of marriage, she had caught herself watching the First Past the Post feature by the Major on her V. The Major recommended Warp Factor 10 in the 2:30 at Gorgon Gap Park. Heaven on Earth, Aldebaran, the acknowledged centre of Coop racing. Her hand had reached unconsciously for her Hollow V. Her glance shot like summer lightning towards the bookmaker icon. She was a few short seconds from placing 5k each way on the filly in question when she was saved by the sound of very loud travelogue commentary in her ear. Earlier, she had forgotten to close the appropriate function. Thank Mercury it wasn't a Coop race, she thought, but merely a report of the All-Galaxy Sporting Reenactment Society's current tour, which was reaching its close, as was traditional, on Flynn, in the rather hairy system of Migia, close to the galactic hub, with only 3 games left to play. The teams in question were the gentlemen, the tourists, and the visitors. They were pretty evenly matched, and no one in particular tipped to win the coveted Big Arrow, more formally known sometimes as the Jewelled Arrow of Artemis, or simply the Silver Shaft, so rarely seen except during its presentation to the winner. Had she not been painfully bored by that particular sport, individual matches of which could be played over periods of weeks, sometimes months, and included tiebreakers involving archaic and baffling skills resurrected from the home planet's dim past, she might just have considered a flutter on the outcome, Large sums were said to change hands among enthusiasts. No, had she slipped and vied her bookie, her full 5 years of refusing so much as to buy a lottery ticket would have been as dishwater down the drain. Happily, a reenactment game of, say, nut-cracking filled her with an instant ennui and quivering disgust. So, with a blink, it was easy enough to turn off her V. She turned it on again almost at once, as a solution to her problems popped into her consciousness. She checked her V-mail for a letter she half remembered receiving. Someone from the Terraphiles whom she had planned to ignore as firmly as only the wealthy can. Ah, there it was. An oddly dressed, bleating old fogey asking her to present the prize to the winner of the 15th Quarter Millennium Terraphile Reenactment Tournament on Flynn. They were offering all expenses paid for two and space travel to Flynn in the Migia system aboard the luxury tour liner, the ISS Gargantua, stopping at a number of picturesque planets designed to replicate the beauties and customs of ancient Earth. Courtesy, Messrs. Tip Top Travel, Incorporated. Like most rich people, Mrs. Banning loved a bargain. What could be better than a free holiday, and, including their daughter, 2/3 paid for by someone other than herself or her husband? An ancestor might have cried, Eureka! As it was, she was momentarily consumed with admiration of her own astonishing intellect. In a matter of minutes, she had replied to the Terraphiles to say that she would be delighted to accept their offer to present the Silver Arrow at the conclusion of their great tournament. She would make travel arrangements and send the bill to their appropriate department. Then she committed herself, her husband, Urquhart, and her beautiful daughter Jane, a.k.a. Flapper, to what she was assured was Messrs. Tip-Top Travel Inc.'s Deluxe Galactic Reenactment Tours. Messrs. Tip-Top assured the public that their tour was the finest and most select available, being both educational and healthy. Everything would be provided, including the latest and most sophisticated nanotech translation pill, cultural information, and style advice. In other words, she thought, Mr. Banning Cannon and the apple of their eye could educate themselves at a substantial discount while she, Mrs. BC, took a well-earned dose in the suns of a score of sultry systems while occasionally indulging in her other vice, clinically known as millionairophilia, the ancient compulsion to shop for hats. What was more, she had a good chance of solving a remaining problem. Her daughter might, with luck, find and marry a peer. She was, she admitted to herself, just a little hazy about what a peer actually was, but she knew her friends would be envious. So there we have our setup for this Doctor Who novel. We have a rich woman who's been enticed to present a prize which may or may not be the staff of law or the rune staff. And she's got a love of hats and she's going to be able to indulge this on this ridiculous trip. What a setup for a Doctor Who story. It's not common, is it?
No.
But it is amazing.
Like you said, I've not read much. I think the only Sheckley I've read is Dimension of Wonders.
Dimension of Miracles.
I think the book the Dimension of Miracles and the book they turned into Free Jack with Mick Jagger.
Yeah, Immortality Incorporated.
And no, this very much has like that kind of 27 setups and jokes a minute. It's like with Douglas Adams.
Yeah.
It's like I always say about Douglas Adams. Douglas Adams threw away more fantastic science fiction ideas as one-line jokes or paragraph asides than some writers have done in their entire career. And as such, Douglas Adams is a git. Love the man, but just the way he could just come up with just fantastically insane concepts and then just kind of go, I'm just going to use this for a 2-line gag.
There's a lot of that in here, isn't there? And there's a lot. Not only is there a lot of it in here, the name drops and obscure and not so obscure references come thick and fast. There's another part in here that we've not only got the reference to Old Barsoom, which of course is the Mars of the John Carter novels. We've not got the references to Moorcock's Multiverse, which there's lots and lots of, including the cosmology and lore of the multiverse. But also, at one point, there's a reference to Gary Gygax and a dragon lance, which I found absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, especially given like the history of Moorcock and D&D.
It did make me... I mean, Moorcock's obviously a big reader and is also one of those authors who would pop up in the broadsheets reviewing other books like lots of novelists do. Did he ever read a Dragonlance book? I don't know. It's a fascinating concept, isn't it?
it's almost terrifying. You want to know, but on the other hand, you don't want to know. There's definitely a few references to Sexton Blake.
Yes.
That old Morcockian passion.
Yeah, and of course, he recently co-wrote a Sexton Blake book, didn't he?
Yeah.
Which came out back end of last year, I think. Which I actually picked up 2 copies, one for each me and Phil to read, and then we could have talked about it. I was going to send one to a patron, but they've just ended up on the to read pile. But I mean, in one of our more drunken conversations, Tash and I actually talked about doing the first Dragonlance book, and we were drunk, so it never actually came to pass. And by the way, Tash sends everybody her regards. I was at her wedding on Friday.
Oh,
yeah. So, and not only was I at a wedding, which was not quite a shotgun affair, but I only found out about it about 3 weeks ago. So I drove down to the Cotswolds and had a very pleasant afternoon in the registry office and an evening in a big tent in a farmer's field with lots of booze and Kipton. My first ever experience of glamping, I think you'd call it, which was a bell tent with a double bed with full duvet and pillows and everything. It was marvellous. I tumbled in there drunk to give Phil a call, and I never made it back out the tent again. So that was my evening over at about 9:45. I'd been drinking Diplomatico rum for a couple of hours and gas into this guy from Liverpool Council, of all places. And I thought, I'll go give Phil a ring. And I gave her a ring, and that was it. I was out like a light because that bed was so comfy. Yeah. But yeah, we just think, maybe it's in scope, but it's not in scope because we didn't do it. But she did say to me, have you read your book yet? Because a while back, before things went slightly pear-shaped in real life, I'd had a conversation with Tash on a messenger app, and we talked about doing a book. So I've decided that because my attempts to get Tash to do a book that I wanted her to do generally came up blank, I think that's largely because of Danis. #fucking Danis. She's never forgiven me for it. You're a much more forgiving person than Tash, Miles, because you did go with me and came back. But Tash was like, no, after Danis, it's like, fuck off, mate. If we're going to do something, I'm going to decide what it is. And she ended up deciding on a Red Dwarf novel.
Oh, which one?
I can't remember. It's on the kitchen table. It arrived a couple of months ago, and it's on the kitchen table, and it's still on the kitchen table. But it's one of the Red Dwarf novels. I'll tell you later, because I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. And she said, have you read the book yet? So despite the fact that, she's getting married and everything else, she was flying off to Morocco on a honeymoon, Tash still wants to come back, but she wants to do a Red Dwarf novel. So at some point later in the year, Tash will be back.
The Red Dwarf novels are pretty good.
Well, she's sold me on it, so yeah, we'll give it a look. Anyway, back to this book. He also name-checks a Harkwin member, Dick Mick, in this case. And, of course, most importantly, we've learned of Mrs. BC's millionaireophilia and her desire for a very splendid hat, which she buys. She proceeds to buy, much to Mr. Banning-Cannon's consternation. It's not unfair to say that his default state was generally that of a Spanish bull, who, already in a blood-maddened rage, has taken exception to a toreador waving a silly red silk cape under his nose. Save where the sole fruit of his loins was concerned, he was inclined to regard the galaxy's younger billions as decidedly inferior specimens. The inhabitants of this particular world he considered especially unworthy, not only lazy, but vacuous, a planet full of wasters. To be asked for his daughter's hand by one of them would be harder to swallow than a whole Gouda cheese washed down with a pint of malt vinegar. And he should know, because he had attempted this feat in earlier and happier days as the family's prodigal. So his wife's tendency to millionaireophilia was in comparison a cooing dove and a balmy breeze to Mr. BC's soul, except, that is, for the most recent outbreak of a maniacal ability to pick and purchase the largest, ugliest and most expensive hats in the known universe, and, he suspected, beyond. This he was still brooding upon as he lay back in his chair and listened to the restful twang of the yew and the calming thump of the oak. Until now he had known neither rest nor calm. On the previous day, Enola Banning-Cannon had returned to their hotel apartments followed by 2 sturdy bots carrying between them a monstrous hat box. When opened, the box revealed the most stomach-turning confection of poisonous colours, ebony, feathers, gauze, ivory, bits of silver, gold, and presumably platinum wire, plus a whole shower of precious stones mined from the bowels of 100 planets. 4 multifaceted gems resembling eyes, a hole more than adequately arching over its generous brim of about 1.5 meters around his spouse's head, and bearing an uncanny likeness to a Shummy-Yunny, the predatory arachnid occupant of Perseus 9, which was actually the creature of nightmares. Certainly, of Mr. BC's nightmares. These said creatures were inclined to fill him with a mixture of nausea, dizziness, and an irresistible tendency to race into the world cawing like a rook and tearing off all his clothes until he had located a small dark place into which he could lock himself and give vent to his inevitable diarrhea. He had barely been able to control himself when, suspecting his dislike of a confection squatting on her head like a spider poised to leap, she had ordered it back in its box, saying she was humouring him now, but I shall, of course, be wearing it for the Ale of Locksley's garden party. I thought you said he was a lord, murmured Mr. B.C. before the rest of her meaning had sunk in. He's both and more. The bluer the blood, I gather, the more names and titles you're allowed. Anyway, I intend to make a splash at Castle Locksley Hall tomorrow. I've heard these title types like to sport spectacular hats at important dates in the social calendar. This is the biggest event after the 3-legged water ski race held in Aquarius every spring. My hat, I have every confidence, will slaughter all opposition. And then the shock hit the elder Banning Cannon, and he reeled. In fact, he reeled several times as he tried to find breath. Ugh, he said in tones of absolute panic. She had no trouble understanding this, nor did she have any difficulty in shaking her head and repeating her intentions to sport the hideous concoction at the next day's farewell ceremony. It shall be worn, she announced firmly. It is a Diana Prize-winning original. It is called Variations on a Theme by Aristophanes, a classic title, Diana herself assured me. Glowing bright red before fading to a rather delicate mauve, Mr. B.C. had threatened and been ignored, begged and been greeted with a sniff of disdain. He had wept, only to be spurned contemptuously by this belle dame sans merci. He had reminded her of his phobia and been told to pull himself together. He had warned her that he would become the laughingstock of the entire galaxy, and she had retorted that it was probably no less than he deserved. He had offered bribes only to be reminded that his recent losses on the plan to turn Skilgum Crooks into one vast rose garden measuring light years across had made him, for the time being, somewhat dependent on her fortune. His plans for financial recovery, he had told her miserably, would probably be scotched forever if he was to be seen mewling like a baby and tearing off his clothes while heading blindly for the Ale's nearest ornamental rain barrel. This she had pooh-poohed as nothing less than emotional blackmail. She had paid a great deal of money for a hat, an original creation, she reminded him again, of the immeasurably fashionable Diana of Loondoon, and she knew it would make her costume the talking point of the season, which he knew, full well, could only be good for his business. So that's the first layer of our intrigue, isn't it? Now, this book has got some really stinking reviews on Amazon and Goodreads from hardcore Doctor Who fans. And of course, it's quite easy to understand.
Yeah, like I remember first time I read the book, I was incredibly disappointed.
Yeah,
but I think I went in hoping for something like the Black Corridor or the Shores of Death, or one of Moorcock's more traditionally darker SF.
Yeah.
Instead, at so many points, this feels like the Dances at the End of Time books, just incredibly toned down, and a lot of the more sexually explicit occurrences in those books taken out.
Yeah, it's very Dances at the End of Time. It's super Woodhouse. You know, the fact that you've got an aristocrat whose wife is obsessed with buying a hat which he finds unbearably ugly, but is reliant on her fortune because of his bad business decisions, and this will end up playing a part in the intrigue, is straight out of a Woodhouse novel. It's exactly the type of stuff that happens at Blanding's Castle in the Woodhouse novels. And, you know, you've got the additional complications because she suggested an arrangement with an English aristocrat, Bingo Locksley. There is a Bingo character in the P.G. Woodhouse books, in the Jeeves books. I can't remember the surname. It's Bingo something or other. The particular hat that she has a fixation on must be temporarily stolen away, and that's part of his plan. Locksley has got designs of the archery competition, the prize of which is the Arrow of Law, which he seeks to win this confused me. He seeks to win it and restore King Richard to the throne of his world Richard currently being off waging holy war on another world, a war that involves balloons. it is so ridiculous.
It's pretty insane.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I can't get enough of it. And it's this archery competition that the Doctor happens to be competing in. So shortly after this arrangement is made, the Doctor and Amy visit Bingo, who's starting to panic and have second thoughts over his role in the hat theft, which is agreed to, because basically he's a massive coward, but he's also instantly in love with Amy. So they're here not just because the Doctor himself is a Terraphile, but we find out that they've learned that Frank struck Freddy Force and his antimatter men have crossed into this universe, and particularly this part of the universe, to find something valuable and powerful. Now, we know at this stage that Captain Cornelius is after the Doctor. You get this idea, what is this powerful, valuable thing that Frank struck Freddy Force and his antimatter men are coming to get? And we'll find out eventually, but at first you think it's going to be the TARDIS, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's going to be the TARDIS.
It's going to be, some sort of ancient Gallifreyan technology or secret.
Let's just read this last little bit, because of course we've actually got Amy and the Doctor involved now. Why don't you read the Doctor's lines?
All right.
You think we might be on a wild goose chase then, Doctor?
No. The message was pretty convincing, and its location. Miggy is a significant star. It's right at the center of the ghost world, so it's close to the apex.
He steepled his hands to show her.
Do you see? And when a trusted informant tells that General Frank/Freddy Force and his antimatter men have crossed into our space, it's important to believe them, especially when that someone is talking from a point just barely on the right side of the Schwarzschild radius in the Sagittarian cloud, and has a familiar particular note of fear in their voice.
He stared off thoughtfully into the distance.
They say old Renark, Lord of the Rim, the first man ever to try and enter a black hole, is still in there, stuck forever between his last moment of life and his first moment of death. And of course, General Frank/Freddy and co. won't be too far from that black hole either, for fear of being stranded. You see our problem?
Not really. Amy wasn't quite sure where to start, but she took a deep breath and asked, "What's matter and antimatter? How do they work?"
Look at this. My bow tie. The central knot's the black hole. This side of the triangular bow is matter. This other side is antimatter. They are self-perpetuating, like law and chaos. Same thing, see?
Amy nodded sagely. She hoped. She certainly wished she looked sager than she felt. So, there we go. Law, chaos, ghost worlds, Renark of the book The Sundered Worlds, a.k.a. the Blood Red Game. So we have our instant references, and this is tying this book and the universe of Doctor Who firmly into Moorcock's multiverse. Not only his multiverse, but Moorcock's 60s science fiction. I think what's most wonderful to me about all this is you expect Mike to inject some of his identity and stylings into a work of IP fiction, but you don't necessarily expect it to come in the style of Dancers at the End of Time. Or maybe you do, because it makes a kind of sense. Because, I mean, we haven't got to the Dancers trilogy on this podcast, but in a similar way to the Winds of Limbo, those stories are thematically quite compatible with the Doctor Who mythos and lore, and could be an alternate take on what the Time Lords could have developed into. Because the first book in that line, An Alien Heat, the first of the Dancers at the End of Time novels, comes out in 1972, the year of the John Pertwee stories Day of the Daleks and Curse of Peladon, so they were roughly contemporary with when he was writing An Alien Heat. So after his period of effectively being marooned on Earth by the Time Lords, the Doctor has his materialisation circuit that he's working on, and he and Jo are eventually able to travel that season in time and space. In An Alien Heat, our protagonist Jarek Carnelian is one of the final louche and mostly pleasure-obsessed citizens of the dying Earth at the very end of time, individuals that possess immense power thanks to time rings, and as a result exist in an almost utopic state where their passions, obsessions, and sheer boredom cause them to take on specific obsessions and eccentric identities with florid names, and they entertain themselves at the expense of people and creatures from other periods in time. And to cut a long story short, and simplify it somewhat, Jarek encounters a 19th century lady called Miss Amelia Underwood, and they have 3 books worth of adventures travelling in time and space. There's a lot of parallels there, isn't there? So actually, it kind of makes some sense. And
Yeah.
in 1971, when An Alien Heat was being written, the lore of the Time Lords and Gallifrey was fairly undeveloped. So,
no, they were basically gods at that point.
Yeah, so you're on with your rewatch. Where was the series with Gallifrey and the Time Lords at this point?
At my point, I'm still early in Troughton, and so the Time Lords don't even get mentioned until the very last story of the Troughton era, when the name the Time Lords finally gets dropped.
Yes,
because at this point it's always just been the Doctor's people. Like, we've met the monk who is one of the Doctor's people, but it's the reference and has never gone beyond that.
So in the
it's either
in the ones with the monk, that is when there's finally a suggestion: is it that the Doctor is not an Earthman, or is that established earlier?
Yeah, I think it's just implied that he's not human, or not from human society.
Because I think there was a lot of speculation at the time. Was he from the far future? You know, I think the Peter Cushing films probably contributed somewhat to the fact that he was just like an eccentric old professor,
just a mad scientist.
But yeah,
the
War Games, which again is it's a challenging watch because I think it's 10 episodes long. The War Games, and there's a lot of capture, recapture, escape, capture, escape, capture. But the last couple of episodes of the War Games, because you've got the War Master, haven't you? Who is one of the key characters who's essentially playing all these games, dragging soldiers from various periods of time, pitting them against each other in wars. And it turns out, by the end, we find out he is also a renegade Time Lord. And Patrick Troughton Doctor defeats the War Master, but as part of it, gets caught by the Time Lords.
No, it's not that he defeats the War Master. It's that the situation is so out of his capacity to handle that he has no choice but to actually send a message to the Time Lords telling them what's going on.
Right.
But he knows the moment he'll do that the Time Lords will finally be able to catch him, and catch him they do, and put him on trial for interfering.
Yeah. And banish him to Earth, where he becomes John Pertwee, complete with sailor's tattoo in Spearhead from Space. The point where Doctor Who actually moves into colour as well. And the wonderful thing about Spearhead from Space, of course, recorded on 16mm film as well, because
it's all shot on film.
Yeah, there was a strike, so they couldn't use television cameras. So as a result, Spearhead from Space is one of the greatest looking and nicely shot stories of Doctor Who of all time as well. So during that period of John Pertwee, we get a little bit of additional development, but very little, in that the Master is introduced, of course, isn't he? So the Master, another renegade Time Lord, who's deeply evil, played by the great Roger Delgado, who was just wonderful. Sadly, died in a car accident which curtailed his, while making a film in Italy, I think. He died in a car accident, which was a terrible shame. Just the interplay, the chemistry between Delgado and John Pertwee it's never ever been bettered.
I think Capaldi and Michelle Gomez almost capture it.
They were good,
but I think because they're the first. I would say they're the first kind of Doctor and Master who actually feel like they used to be friends.
Yeah,
and that they're both trying in their own way to kind of make the friendship work again.
Yeah, you never really got that sense with the Anthony Ainley Master.
No, he was never my favorite. Also, I think in the serial of Quatermass 2, I think Delgado plays the newspaper reporter who's the Sid James character in the movie.
Interesting. I think some of that's on YouTube. I really must watch it at some point. Yeah. There was some lore development of the Time Lords. I think at one point in the John Pertwee stories, he ends up managing to fix his TARDIS because the Time Lords have him do some favours for them.
Pretty much.
Yeah, because of the Master. So they end up giving him the right things to fix his chameleon circuit. So around about this time, when An Alien Heat is written, that's about the limit of the development of the Time Lords that you've got. So actually, a lot of this stuff really fits quite nicely, I think. And even with modern Doctor Who, I think it can still work. But I think, the Fire Clown, i.e. aka Winds of Limbo, and the Dance at the End of Time for me, a much more interesting solutions to what the Doctor could have been and how the Time Lords might have been explained. Because the later developments in the Tom Baker era did venture down a relatively entertaining path with the Time Lords, but it dispelled all of the mystery that we saw in the War Games. In the Deadly Assassin, the Invasion of Time and the Deadly Assassin, the Time Lords are basically just a bunch of old duffers who might as well be the House of Lords, which is an interesting idea and entertaining in a way, but it kind of defeated.
Just at that point, just Gallifrey just seems so entropic in and of itself that there is nothing to do but just decay. So you see why the Doctor just went, nope, out and out.
Yeah. It's just a shame that, that element of mystery about the Time Lords and their power that you got at the end of the War Games, where you also got some really terrific late 60s like visual aesthetics as well, and design work and production design around, how they operated and how they dressed and everything else, which was really cool. The established look and garb of the Time Lords that was established in the Invasion of Time and the Deadly Assassin pretty much carried through all the way from that point onwards, didn't it?
Yeah.
Even up to the Timothy Dalton, one-off special where the same robes, the same outrageous collars, that kind of
the same funny hats.
Yeah. Now there was a lot more development with the Time Lords later on, but I'd stopped watching it by then because I never saw all of Trial of a Time Lord, for example, the Colin Baker serial. What happened with the Time Lords later on? By the time I was not watching,
they, with the exception of, I think Trial of a Time Lord is the last time they're really prominent in the show.
Yeah,
because I think even then it was like, no, we could just kind of just put them off to one side, where the Doctor's put on trial again by another renegade Time Lord, who actually turns out to be the Doctor from the future, like an evil, the Valiard, like an evil incarnation of like between his 12th and 13th incarnation,
right?
Who is utterly evil and played by Michael Jaston, who I think was in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I can't remember him from anything else.
Yeah,
because he reads a lot of the John le Carré Smiley novels.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about between the 12th and 13th Doctor now, would that be the War Doctor?
No, because that's between 8th and 9th.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he would be between, like, Capaldi and Whittaker.
Ah, right, okay. Anyway, back to the book. So we've got all these references to contemporary historical individuals like Dick Mick and W.G. Grace. So people are cosplaying as W.G. Grace, effectively. And it's justified by a line from the Doctor when he references that personality pills that people take in this future to relive that society's take on these people from the past, often many over the course of a lifetime. Again, a very Dances at the End of Time-esque concept, which is quite interesting. Bingo gets brave enough to undertake the hat heist anyway, but someone gets there before him, and as things take another farcical turn, he ends up almost caught in the act, but unfortunately instead embraced as a hero for trying to stop the thieves. And the old Bill get involved, one of whom is like someone's cousin or something, and for one reason or another the finals match for the Silver Arrow is in jeopardy due to the crime, and their shuttle to the stop that will take them to Migia for the finals has been cancelled for reasons that I can't really remember. But they have. Right now, we're at a point where it's become full-on Woodhouseian farce. So we've got this little bit here. So I won't read it. We've said it. So it's now a PG Woodhouse farce about the theft of a hat at a country pile during a high society event, with the Doctor playing as an anti-Bertie Wooster to solve the mystery. It even has the complications around Flapper using Lord Bingo as a sort of romantic stalking horse to manipulate our doting suitor and Bingo's best friend, Harry Agincourt, into making his move. And yes, Eddie G's family know Bingo Little is one of Bertie Wooster's best friends from the Drones Club, so Mike is not exactly obscuring his references too much here, or in fact, at all. And that is straight out of a Jeeves novel. And it's marvellous, but I used to read a lot of Woodhouse as a teenager, sort of accidentally, originally, because... And there's a weird link to Doctor Who as well, because we went to Spain when I was in my early... I was maybe 14? Yeah, around about 14. By this point, my sisters were 17 and 18, and they were like, no, I don't want to go on holiday with the parents anymore. So me and my mum and dad went to Spain, stayed in a place called Palamos. And we're walking down the street in Palamos, And I look over the way, and sat at a bar, waving his glass of booze at me, is a teacher who I had called Neil Simmons. Right? He was my English teacher at junior school. And to cut a very long story short, I spent the rest of that week getting drunk with my old English teacher. And I'd taken Target Doctor Who books on holiday with me, maybe 4 of them. And I'd read them all by midweek because my mum and dad would like to go and lay on the beach, and so I would just read. So I'd read all my books, and he lent me half a dozen Jeeves novels that he'd took. He'd been there for the week before us. That was his second week. He'd read them all. So he just gave me this pile of 6 Jeeves books. And we were there for a week after that. So I spent the rest of my holiday reading these half dozen Jeeves books. Yeah. Weird Woodhouse Doctor Who connection. But yeah, Moorcock does it so well. He does it so well. So there's this little bit here.
What page are we on?
I think I've written my page numbers down wrong because I'm not finding I'm not finding what I'm supposed to be reading. Where are we? Oh, here we go. I've got it. Inwardly, Bingo was writhing, aware that because of his own selfishness in taking Mrs. Banning Cannon up on his offer, he had let down his own side with a vengeance. Also, he had let down Harry and Flapper. Given different circumstances, he might have begun keening wildly, but he was of old English stock. He contented himself by keening silently within. If only he had thought of the consequences for a moment. He wanted so badly to tell the truth. He had scarcely told a lie since he was 7, when he had pinched a jar of strawberry jam from the kitchen cupboard, then tried to blame cook and a housemaid for the crime, forgetting that, since both were androids, they had no taste for human food at all. He shut his mouth tightly when he remembered that moment. He ought to have realised then that he didn't have the brains or personality to be a master crook, and now his story was thinner than a Copernican gas cloud. If it weren't for Mrs. Banning Cannon backing him up and the doctor also apparently trying to help him out, he would have been up the creek and crying for a paddle. As it was, he could see himself making all sorts of slips when actually talking to the peelers. He shuddered. Not only would he lose Loxley Hall, he would spend years on a prison planet, pumping water from the tankers of aqua supplies to sell for vast profits to the mining worlds and the desert planets which were not worth terraforming. In a different set of circumstances, his best friend Harry would have sensed his anxiety by now and come to stand beside him, but Harry was standing meaningfully elsewhere, at the far end of the room. It's just fantastic. It's so Woodhouse, it's ridiculous. And at this point, I did start to wonder if, at some point, had he been outlining or even writing a Woodhouseian farce and decided to retrofit a lot of it when he got the Who gig, or maybe Who didn't carry enough resonance for him, so he's just being self-indulgent. Either way, good for him, because this is great.
Yeah.
But I found a Guardian article he wrote in 2009 about this very gig, writing this book, and he starts the article with, "This past year or two I've been revisiting what you might call my cultural roots, because I was distracted almost daily by treatment for a wounded foot and unable to work much. I began rereading the P.G. Wodehouse, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and Sexton Blake stories I enjoyed as a kid." So, there you go. He was reading this stuff round about the time he got the gig doing this. And in the same article he says, "About the only real science fiction I've written since the 1960s was the Dances at the End of Time stories, all done in the 70s. The comedies set in the distant future with a nod to the fin de siècle of Oscar Wilde, H.G. Wells, Ernest Dowson, and The Yellow Book. Both comedy and SF depend on compression and exaggeration and are very often entertaining when combined. There's a long tradition of it. Even Woodhouse wrote a funny futuristic story early in his career, The Swoop, or How Clarence Saved England. In the SF magazines, writers such as Henry Kuttner, Robert Sheckley, and L. Sprague de Camp were best loved for their comedy. Douglas Adams, of course, hit the jackpot in the 70s with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Davies and his writers realised this when the Doctor made his comeback some 5 years ago with Christopher Eccleston and then David Tennant in the role. Both actors have a talent for comedy and melodrama. The plots become increasingly complex, playing with ideas of time and space, and I became an addict again." So, there you go. He was reading shitloads of Woodhouse, and he's absolutely acknowledging what his inspirations were for doing this. And as a Woodhouse guy in my distant past, I really need to find that futuristic story, but I love all this section. And the whole book could have been this for me, quite happily. But unfortunately for me, the hat box gets found in some bushes a couple of pages later, and the Doctor delights everyone with his use of a galactic route planner that means they can get to Migia in time, after all. And finally, for the first time in the first third of this book, we get a really rather nice passage with the Doctor and Amy, and the voice and manner of Matt Smith's Doctor, as we said before, are quite well realised, I thought. So yeah, and that's essentially the first part of the book. That's the end of the first act. You know, Moorcock very much sticking with his 3-book stroke act structure here.
Yeah.
We have a handy interval with another Cornelius intermission, and then we're off into episode 2, or part 2, or book 2, or whatever we want to call it, and we're off into space. And it is for a period of time, there is a slight change in tone, I think, because it's really quite excellent. I love the bits with Amy wandering around the ship, pondering the technology and the crew and the Centaur captain. I also like that they are rocketing about in the TARDIS as a way to make the plot all breathless. We haven't even heard about the TARDIS, only that the Doctor is, keeping it hidden for one reason or another. And they're on a journey to solve some kind of mystery, although the mystery is still sort of vague. We still don't really understand, other than the Doctor's worried about Frank Freddy Force and his antimatter men coming into this universe. And that's really all we know at this point.
Yeah.
And the Doctor is perturbed by some of these events. Yeah, but it's good stuff. Amy has a psychedelic experience courtesy of a time tornado, during which she hears strange singing from the Bubbly Boys. It's a very silly song, but the Doctor knows what and who they are, these space shanty singers. So let's flip on to page 120. She heard the Doctor's voice.
Don't worry, they're on our side. Probably. Blood's thicker than any wild tide. Al, Tom, and Bob Bubbly, Captain Aberley's crew, 3 of the famous Chaos Engineers. They know the second ether better than anyone.
She turned her head. They had all gone. The ship's movement seemed slow, and she was certainly steady. The storm was over. Amy got out of a bunk. She found the Doctor in the dormitory he was sharing with another 20 or 30 men. He was leafing through star charts, making notes on a V-pad, and looked up when she came in.
You okay now? I'd have warned you if I'd had any sense that was going to catch us. Those winds shouldn't have occurred anywhere near here. It's just plain wrong. Did you meet the Bubbly Boys? I asked them to keep an eye on you.
She nodded. What are you doing, Doctor? Puzzles?
I wish. I'm too easily bored. Why is it, Amy Pond, that we're travelling at twice the speed of Earthlight and I feel like we're limping along at a snail's pace? Was that Mrs. BC out there before the storm caught us?
Yeah, I think I was wrong about that theory of mine. She'd never deliberately brought this on herself. What do you think? It didn't seem strange to be talking normally again. Somehow the storm had refreshed her, like a long sleep.
I'm sticking to my theory, that we're looking in the wrong places for the thief.
He glanced up to watch cobalt blue bands of light winding themselves around knots of copper pipe. A little spillage from the nuclearoid engines, which he had assured her wasn't dangerous.
I suppose you never came across that book by Barry Payne, he asked. The one before? I was enjoying it. Funny how nobody ever reinvented that kind of fiction. I knew most of these guys who came out in the 1890s, the new journalism, some of them called it. More than one bunch under the same tag, like the 1960s. Nothing was around in your day that they hadn't thought of. I'd like to take you back there sometime. Pet Ridge, Arthur Machen, J.M. Barrie, H.G. Wells, Jerome K. Jerome, P.G. Wodehouse, lots of them, when they were all writing for the Pall Mall and the Fortnightly. Very funny, too. Payne. A lot of them.
He spoke absently, like someone trying to remember happier days. Amy had the feeling he was reluctant to say what was really on his mind, but she knew he wouldn't tell her any more than he wanted to. Unless... Are you trying to protect me from something? She asked. He looked at her with a bit of the odd twinkle in his old eyes.
If I am, I haven't been very successful. I think I've told you everything I can be sure of.
What? Enough to alarm me?
Everything alarming you is what's alarming me. And I don't really know much more. I can't address any of the big questions, not without help from the TARDIS, and I'm still too scared to try bringing her in. I think there are powerful people looking for her. I can't afford not to keep her hidden. And the dark tides might rip the TARDIS apart, or she could slip into another universe and we'd never see her again. The TARDIS is safest hidden from me as well from anyone chasing us. So let's concentrate on the questions we can answer. Why is that hat still bothering me? It seems trivial, but it's important to what we're here for. I know it is. We've worked out who planned to steal it, who is going to steal it, and why. We aren't any further forward working out who actually stole it or why.
He was tired, leaning back on his bunk with his hands behind his head.
I think if we had just a couple of answers, we'd know better what to do. So we keep on hopping from one grubby old spaceport to another and hoping we'll find out before we get to Migia. Do you know who the planet's named after?
Who?
A legendary queen of Sirot. In the great fight between the forces of law and chaos, she stood for law. There was a war between the archangels of law and the archangels of chaos. A bit Miltonian, but there you go. Only without all that religion, thankfully. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes! This queen led her forces into what was called the Battle for the Balance. So that was more like Ragnarok, I suppose, the end of everything. But the old chronicles rarely describe her as a force for good, though she fought for law, which is supposed to be good, right? She was seen as one who would rather kill for a principle than let an enemy live for a chance to make things better. That's law gone sour, function forgotten, and E.J. Milton wrote a whole epic poem about it. Her own troops stopped trusting her in the end. She spread so much carnage, they were sickened by the amount of blood she spilled for what she considered an ideal. You've heard people say, that was positively Midgian. Oh, you haven't? Really? Well, you know what I mean. Makes you think. That's why sports are so important. Well, I've just decided sports are so important. People rarely play sports for a principle, do they?
It depends, she said, glad finally to get a word in and determined to make use of it, whether you're a Rangers or a Celtic supporter. She was glad when he laughed spontaneously. She realised it had been far too long since she had seen him do that.
Okay, that last bit when he goes from talking about this big epic scale of battle to then just talking about sports, that is just a quintessentially feels like a Matt Smith kind of stream of consciousness.
Yeah, it does. There's quite a few things to digest there, aren't there? Because there's another more explicit link to the second Ether stories, effectively cementing the Doctor Who universe as sitting again firmly within Moorcock's multiverse. Something I'm very happy with, because for me, as I said, the likes of the Fire Clan being out there, and certainly with one manifestation of the Fire Clan being pretty much a variation on the Doctor's template in the transformation of Miss Mavis Ming, aka Constant Fire, it kind of makes perfect sense, really. Now, since the Timeless Child arc, does it not make even more sense that there could be an argument, given that Doctor Who is now a canon part of Moorcock's multiverse, that the Fire Clown even is an incarnation of the Doctor? You could argue that.
You could, actually. Either like the Doctor or, the Master.
Yeah. And for the sake of those perhaps who know not of which we speak, Miles, what was the Timeless Child reveal, and why was it so controversial with Who fans?
Okay, all right, I need a quick stiff drink of this one. The Timeless Child gives us the idea that before we meet the Doctor as William Hartnell in a junkyard in Totter's Lane in November 1963, that there was actually a whole series of lives that he didn't know about, which has been implied on and off at some points through Doctor Who, most famously the Brain of Morbius.
Brain of Morbius.
But this kind of finally made it canon, and that there are whole incarnations of the Doctor who had existed before the Doctor that we didn't know about, and that in fact the Time Lord's gift of regeneration was actually something derived from the Doctor, because they are an abandoned child from a world like we don't even know about, that this Gallifreyan called Tech Dayun discovered, and then proceeded to work out how to give her people the ability of regeneration by implying that she killed this poor child and made them regenerate countless times to basically create the Society of the Time Lords. It's controversial because it is how much are you aware of like the work of Alan Moore?
Yeah.
So it's like in Alan Moore, in like his Miracle Man / Marvel Man or Swamp Thing, where the first story arc is basically pulling everything you thought you knew about this character was wrong, and this is how we're going to recontextualize it. I think done fantastically in his run on Swamp Thing, when you find out that Swamp Thing isn't a human who's been mutated into a swamp monster, but actually a swamp monster who thinks he's this guy who got blown up in an accident, which then recontextualizes him because he's actually a plant monster, and they think they killed him by shooting him in the head. And impossible, one of the greatest lines ever in a comic book, you can't kill a vegetable by shooting him in the head. And so it's kind of basically one of those everything you thought you knew was wrong, but it just kind of got presented without really resolve. It's there.
Yeah.
And Chris Chibnall didn't really do anything with it. It was just like, oh hey, let's kind of reintroduce this new mystery to Doctor Who. And the fact that it's introduced but not really, I want to say, resolved, means that it just doesn't. As a retcon, it just kind of feels there, because for all intents and purposes, even though the Ncuti Gatwa has called back to the fact that he doesn't know where he's from, and we had it in Wild Blue Yonder when the 14th Doctor with David Tennant was called out that he doesn't know where he's from. It's not brought in anything new because the Doctor is still the Doctor. The Doctor is still going to be heroic and anti-hero, heroic, anti-heroic. The Doctor is always going to be the Doctor because they've had their memories of that entire time erased. And when given the watch, which had contained all the memories, the Jodie Whittaker Doctor went, right, not dealing with that, and then just popped it in the bowels of the TARDIS, and you're just like, well, you've just kind of made your hero out to be sort of an emotional coward because then they've not made the decision to learn about whatever they could have done before they were who they were. And the other thing is, which I think is the problem I kind of have, we meet this previous incarnation of the Doctor who was called the Doctor and travels around in a stolen TARDIS, which looks like a police box. Who did Black Ops work for Gallifrey because it's Gallifrey. They're run by bastards. Their CIA is quite literally called the CIA, and it's just like, but that honestly does kind of take away from the William Hartnell Doctor, where he was not a particularly nice person who then grew to become a hero. If the Doctor just keeps going through this, keeps going through losing their memory and then effectively learning to become a good person, then you've kind of taken it a little way because he just feels like, oh right, so he's just relearning something that was already in him.
Yeah, I'm broadly okay with the concept, but the execution
that's
left a lot to be desired.
That's kind of where I am because if you said to me, yes, there are lives of the Doctor who look like whoever was on the BBC production staff of Doctor Who at circa 1975, just appearing as a picture while he's having a mental mind bending competition with a giant Frankenstein monster, I'm fine with it. It's great. It's fun. It's just it feels like it's just there to do something with, and not there to be a story.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't really hung up on lore in those days when we were making the Brain of Morbius, whether, and it's more of a thing, I suppose, that nobody freaked out when they introduced the idea of William Hartnell being the original incarnation of the Doctor, and then there being a limit to 12 regenerations. Nobody freaked out and said that contradicts the lore established quite firmly in the Brain of Morbius. That there are, dozens of them.
People freaked out when it was implied that the Doctor was half human in the Paul McGann TV movie.
Yes.
At the same time, people also freaked out when the Paul McGann Doctor kissed a woman.
Yeah.
Though to be fair, if I woke up one day and I looked like Paul McGann, I admit it, I would probably be kissing everyone who would say yes.
Well, you know what? I mean, it's... Daphne Ashbrook was a beautiful woman. He was. I think the thing about that was it was more like a kiss of. It wasn't a horny kiss, was it? It was an exuberant. I'm alive and I'm with a hot woman kiss.
And then when they kiss at the end, it's very much a kiss goodbye.
Yeah.
But again, it's Paul McGann. He's a very attractive person, so I wouldn't say no.
Yeah, he's a good looking guy. I think one of my biggest regrets, funnily enough, is that I think they could quite easily have done a Paul McGann series and rationalised it quite easily.
Yeah.
If there were, rather than having a mad dash to recruit a new Doctor, give Paul McGann a series.
Yeah.
For God's sake.
I feel like since he's done more Doctor Who stuff since then, I feel he's definitely had more of a chance to work out more of a character, and he has a fantastic voice for audio. And they had him in that one little short teaser for the 50th, where he regenerates into young John Hurt, and he's great in that. Like he manages to steal the show in like 10 minutes.
Yeah, and of course, not only is his look is great, which is like a combination of like his monocled mutineer uniform and a classic Doctor Who, costume, but also linked there with Brain of Morbius, isn't there, in that 10-minute short? Because the sect of women who feature in that, or it's one actor really, isn't it? It's the I can't remember her name. Hellraiser. She played Julia in Hellraiser.
Really? That was Julie from Hellraiser?
Yeah.
Wow, I did not notice that.
Oh yeah, I forget her name, but yeah, Julia from Hellraiser, and she is one of the sect of female priestesses from the Brain of Morbius. Yeah, so a little connection there. I mean, that's one thing you've got to say for Russell T Davies. He does know his classic.
Yeah,
film.
like,
and you could tell he was steeped in it.
I think that was Stephen Moffat.
Was that
That's
Moffat?
The Moffat era. It's like they definitely they know their shit, and sometimes for good or ill.
So next chapter, couple of wonderful things in this chapter. There's a pirate attack, which is generally just a close call when they come under attack from space pirates. But there's some, as we were talking about earlier, there's some throwaway ideas in here that I absolutely love. And first, this one is so obvious that I can't believe the show has never done it.
Isn't Groan the name of the Earth Elemental Elric sometimes summons, or am I? That's Grom.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's Grom. Yeah, that's Grom. There's this lovely paragraph here. It says, the Doctor was more interested in staring at the screens, trying to make out the nature of their likely attackers. The crenellated jade-like figuring along the hulls of the 7 ships closing in on them was a sign that they had belonged to the old Monarchy invaders from the Arkwright cluster. But this lot had been wiped out ages ago. The ships were probably owned now by renegade members of the Drukshanjun clans, exiled many generations earlier for Dalek worship, a quasi-religious cult which believed the Doctor's old enemies would one day return to take over the galaxy. The Doctor had no time for the renegades or their beliefs, but he knew their potential for destruction and took them seriously. Now, rather than bringing Daleks back all the time and having them dispatched really easily, the idea of having a Dalek cult worshipping them and kind of portentously predicting their re-arrival is a great idea. Why, in 60 years of Doctor Who, has nobody ever done this?
There are some ideas in Doctor Who which which they turn up. You're like, how did no one think of doing this earlier?
Yeah. And so instead of having them turn up and turn blokes in New York into pigmen or some such garbage, mythologize them, build their legend. It's ditto the Cybermen.
I'll be honest. I actually kind of like the Daleks in Manhattan story, if only because yes. Well, okay, I'm never coming back on the podcast, so I'm coming from that expression. But hear me out. The pigmen are stupid, but I feel that the story itself, with the idea that you have the one Dalek who merges with a human to become a human Dalek hybrid with the tentacly face, and the other Daleks just almost immediately, even though he's their leader, reject him and just put him in chains, because the Daleks are faced with the decision that they either have to evolve or die. And because the Daleks are so kind of caught up in their xenophobic hatred of any kind of difference from their norm, that in their own way, they would kind of just choose to just die, then risk change. And I like it when the Dalek stories kind of actually try and do something with like the concept of the Daleks, and just instead of just having them be, end of season, shooty, big explosion, big bad. One of my favorite Dalek stories is Day of the Daleks, when they barely even appear. But when they're just sort of like the unbeatable big bad, who will almost likely get beaten in 50 minutes. It's just, come on, just, you have these fantastic creations, just do something, try and do something new with them.
I appreciate the concept behind Daleks of Manhattan and the idea of the Daleks' xenophobia becoming ultimately self-defeating. But the pigmen and the Dalek man in the pinstripe suit, image-wise, are just fucking terrible. Just really bad. I forgot about Dalek man in pinstripe suit. That's even worse than the pigmen. So again, interesting conceptually, terrible execution. Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that was one of those occasions as well where they think, oh, we've got a budget, let's spend it. What should we spend it on? This is something to spend it
Pigmen.
on. Let's spend it on that.
Spend on
Pig
Pigmen.
makeup. Oh, fuck that. Put the inside of a kettle on the red and call them Robo-Men. Let's just go old school.
Yeah.
The second great thing in this chapter is the Chronai, which is a great idea, the self-defense mechanism of the ship that they're on, which is these strange semi-sentient globes that go out there and turn the attack of the pirates back upon the pirates. And there's quite an amusing exchange.
Oh, I think you missed a shout out with the Arkwright cluster, because with Luther Arkwright.
Of course, Luther Arkwright. Yeah, I was thinking Arkwright out of Open All Hours, but of course it would be Luther Arkwright. Yeah. I forgot all about that. So the Chronai, really good, and then we get this quite amusing exchange between the Doctor and Amy, because he says probably not. What happened to them is that they expected to happen to us, at least until they spotted the crony. Then it was too late for them to get away. She says, I still don't understand. He says, well, they have, so to speak, been hoisted by their own petard. She says, what's a petard? He says, look it up on the internet when you get the chance. You don't know, do you? I used to know. I forgot. Some sort of bomb or booby trap, I think. Anyway, it means that what the pirates planned for is now happening to them instead, because the Chronai, who are wonderful little beings, can turn almost any form of aggression away from themselves and direct it back at the aggressor, usually in a more powerful form. So I love that little exchange about hoist on your own petard, because I actually used that in the conversation with Phil not so long ago, and she had no idea what I was blathering about. And she said, what does that mean? And I couldn't properly explain it. Its origins are Shakespearean, apparently.
It's always Shakespeare. It's usually Shakespeare. It's either Shakespeare or Only Fools and Horses with the English language.
Yeah. And then this is followed up by the Chronai, unfortunately, whilst they defeated the pirate ships, did not defeat the pirate ship's passengers who board the ship. And we'll get another wonderful combo of the Woodhousey whimsy and farce of the first part of the book, when they're boarded by General Freddie Frank Force and his antimatter men. And I just love this. The antimatter men are something that absolutely should be in Doctor Who. They're a fantastic, outlandish sci-fi idea, literal antimatter men in technologically advanced skin suits that stop them interacting with the matter of our universe and causing a catastrophically destructive explosion. But their suits are in the style of psychedelic circus masters for some reason. Just brilliant. Why? I've no idea. Not? Just because. And it's great. But the chapter includes a lot of exposition as well, about the nature of law and chaos, how it's not something that overlays the concept of good and evil, that they represent the cosmic force of law, and they know the Doctor as an agent of chaos. And what makes it even more interesting is the Doctor doesn't disabuse this notion at all, which is fantastic. But then they have this great description of the cosmology where Amy recalls a conversation with some guy on a different planet who she talked to with the Doctor once, called Yimmy Bunny or something. Amy thought the scene disturbing in a number of ways, not least the conscious theatricality assumed by Force and Co. That was more than a bit creepy, yet it was hard for her to see a serious threat, this sinister little man with his curling mustachios and his ringmaster's coat, his bright crimson trousers with a sharp blue stripe tucked into gleaming black boots with huge spurs jingling on them, but she could tell from the Doctor's body language that this was about as serious as it got. He had already hinted as much, hoping that he would never have to do more than hint. But now they faced each other in stalemate. Amy had picked up a little about the antimatter universe from the Doctor, and they'd met an old philosophical jummy bug on latest IO who had explained to her about law and chaos, how the universe maintains stability and creativity, balancing between law on the one hand and chaos on the other. But they were not the same thing. Professor Ormick, the learned Jimmy Bug, had given the impression that philosophically he saw their universe not in terms of good and evil, but in terms of the fundamentals of the multiverse. Law and chaos, order and creativity, matter and antimatter were qualities which became good or evil depending on their context. In balance, Professor Ormick had told her, these qualities kept the multiverse from becoming too rigidly organised or too disorganised. Constant regeneration. There had always been people of quite disparate origins who dedicated their lives to maintaining the status quo, explained the Professor. In the history of the cosmos, the balance tilted sometimes one way, sometimes another. The Time Lords had once helped to maintain that balance. The Professor pointed out that what he called the cosmic balance was a symbolic construct for something enormously complex. He could have told her more, but the maths would have been overwhelming. The balance was the way in which the multiverse maintained its equilibrium so that neither side tilted too far in one direction or another, since these were the two more or less equal forces which kept the multiverse from collapsing into nothingness. Matter and antimatter were not the same as law and chaos. Of course, law and chaos existed in both spheres. So that's kind of as good a description of the cosmology from Moorcock's Multiverse, probably, as you'll find in any of the books. It's pretty good. And we've talked about this before, how like, it's not really about good and evil, because Gran Breton in the History of the Runestaff novels are effectively a lawful force. They're just fucking evil in the way that they implement it and impose order on tragic Millennium Europe. Yeah, so it's all really good.
I like how it's described as both order, as Lord Chaos is described as order and creativity, because I feel that's one of the great that really I feel sums up one of the huge, I would say, conflicts in Doctor Who, in which a lot of the villains, a lot of the monsters are monsters who are just kind of, they're not aliens as say like a Star Trek species. They are monsters, and they're usually enforcing some form of dominance, be it extermination or conversion. And you have the Doctor whose greatest weapon is that he's intelligent and that he can think outside the box at all times.
It's followed up with the motives of law brilliantly captured in an exchange between the Doctor and General Freddy/Frank Force. It is in the nature of law, Doctor, Frank struck Freddy Force's overbright features, splitting a grin of challenging mockery. We are concerned with what you might do someday, what you might do. We cannot help ourselves. It is a constant irritant, an itch which demands to be scratched. Be prepared. We are driven to make neat, as strongly as you, Doctor, are driven to put cats among pigeons, throw spanners in works.
Except that I'm not driven to create strife where there is peace. I don't feel an irresistible urge to spill the milk or stir a pot or whatever else you imply I love to do. I don't travel around the universe constantly seeking the moribund and trying to quicken pulses. Yet you are apparently maddened by the unpredictable, disturbed by everything which isn't thoroughly straightened and mapped and catalogued. And what?
Controlled is the word you're looking for, Doctor. Without the proper controls, we can't see ahead. We can't make accurate predictions. The future goes dreadfully, terribly, miserably wonky. Can't you see that? You and your empathy. Can't you sense how horrible that makes us feel? How can I make you understand the uncertainties of an intelligent antimatter being? Fish got to swim, birds got to fly, Doctor. I got to do one thing till I die. I can't help myself. It's in my anti-DNA. I am who I am. I'm General Force for Law. We are the forces of law. We work in the name of law, and in the name of law, I demand that you give me... This is a fucking brilliant exchange for me, this. I absolutely love it. This bit where it says, you and your empathy, can't you sense how horrible that makes us feel? Is one of the fucking greatest lines I've read in a book from the perspective of a villain in such a fucking long time. And it is basically the rallying cry internally. It's the subconscious rallying cry of every authoritarian populist dickhead out there in the universe. And, that could be... I bet that's what Jacob Rees-Mogg hears in his head.
More likely.
The last thing before he goes to sleep. And, people like that, when they're thinking about somebody who wants to do, someone who is, inverted commas, work.
Yeah.
Oh, you and your empathy.
How dare you think about anything else? I think Jacob Moog, when he goes to bed, he just hears his bank balance just being repeated back to him. Like, he just seems the bloody type.
Yeah, I don't think he's got the self-awareness to even realise for a second. So... Captain Freddy Stroke Frank Force says, I demand that you give me... So what is he after? Is he after the TARDIS? Is he after the Doctor? What's he after? Well, he's after the hat. Of course, he's after the hat. So there's a big confrontation between Force and Co and the Banning Cannons and Harry Agincourt and Bingo Loxley that goes on in wonderful Woodhouse fashion for about 5 pages before the encounter is brought to a halt when the Doctor shoots a practice arrow at General Force's arse and he has to withdraw with an uncomfortable waddle, hatless, by the end. What an incredible chapter.
I kind of read this bit when with Frank Freddy Force. Madam, Beneath the wiggling protective armor, Frank/Freddy Force's skin glowed an unprepossessing peach, clashing with his coat and causing his companions to stare at him in alarm. "I did not steal your hat!"
That's right. Yeah. Oh, it's fantastic. It would make a great. I mean, really, what I want from a Doctor Who series is, number one, if they're going to do an 8-episode series, do one story over 8 episodes, and have this encounter be half of an episode. Lots of dialogue. Lots of old school, the Doctor chewing the fat with the villain like he used to do with the Master in the John Pertwee, Roger Delgado days, or like how Tom Baker would do with Morbius when Morbius is telling him he's going to steal his brain. Have some real meaningful dialogue between the Doctor and the villains and give us some substance. And you can still be goofy, and you can still be colourful, and you can still be weird.
Like you have Frank/Freddy Force going from having a wonderful monologue about like the nature of how his evil is basically just he wants to have that reassurance that everything is going to remain the way it is, and then he is screaming at this pampered aristocrat that who is accusing him of stealing her bloody hat.
Yeah,
like that's
and he's screaming at her, "I did not steal your hat."
Like that's quintessentially camp in like the best, most glorious way.
Yeah. Oh, Frank/Freddy Force is all camp, and it's wonderful. But I hear something. I think the cloister bell is ringing, Miles. We got a little bit further into the book this time, but it looks like this is going to be a 3-parter.
Yep, we've almost made it to the halfway point of the book.
Well, I suppose, thinking about it, we've talked about the new series. We've talked about old series. We're actually running out of things to muse upon about classic Who and modern Who. So when we get together, I reckon we can probably finish this book off.
Oh, definitely.
And considering The Jewel in the Skull is like 130 pages long, and we end up talking about that for like 5 hours, this is a much more robust book than your average Moorcock. So actually doing 3 episodes on this book, I don't think feels too outlandish.
So how glad are you to have a book which doesn't have a random encounter table dice roll every 15 to 20 pages?
You know what? That's a really good point. I think modern, well, not necessarily modern, but Moorcock from the late 80s onwards did move away from that a lot, didn't it? So instead of random encounter tables, we've got random ideas and concept tables, which are just being thrown in and cast away almost for fun. The Chronai are a really good example. The Chronai don't reoccur again in this book, I don't think. No. They're just something that he creates for one scene that are fascinating and interesting, and then they're gone, and you move on, and he'll soon create something else. 40, 50 years ago, it would have been dogs with tortoise heads. Or tortoises with dog heads, called the Weeb Snapples or something. So now we've got something
the Weeb Snapples of Currit Lang.
Yeah, write that down. Write that down. That's going in my next Black Hat game.
No, use it for Stormbringer. Use it for Stormbringer.
Definitely. All right, cheers, Miles. I enjoy the rest of your Monday.
I honestly think I'm having more fun enjoying the book, talking to someone about it, who comes at it from a Moorcock perspective than a Doctor Who perspective.
Yeah, I am going to write a review of this on Goodreads when we're finished to try and balance out all the stinking reviews.
That's right. You be the Goodreads agent of chaos that we need.
Yeah, I will. Well, you know what? Thanks, Miles. Pleasure as always, and I'm sure we'll reconvene again at some point over the summer and finish the fucking book.
I am down.
Massive thanks once again to Miles, and okay, we still didn't get too far into the coming of the Terraphiles, but we did go further down the Who rabbit hole. We'll be back with part 3 sometime and figure out if it really is all just about a stolen hat. In the meantime, be sure to check out the Casual Trek podcast. You can find it on all good podcatchers. We've had some groovy comments again over on Podbean. Our toasted friend Christopher Neely said, "And I blazed and amazed, getting high, while recreational nostalgia plays with a whole accent moderation, narration, and master of dungeon. I have my notepads penciled down book recommendations. Hope to join you soon as a podcaster with my T-Mod cast, the history of disaster cast, weed mythology in history of democratic rule and scientific controversy, a spiritual journey through history, real and imagined. Thanks for inspiration, old bloke. Exterminate! 420, oh no. Puff, puff, pass, motherfucker. Cheers, Chris. Always enjoy reading your comments, and if I inspire someone to start a podcast, that's very cool, as I was in turn inspired to do this 5 years or so ago by others. The cosmic wheel continues to turn. Also on Podbean, our old mucker Mutazoid said of our last Terraphiles episode, "What a cracker. Take your time getting to the book. I loved the meandering chat." Well, this one was for you, Mutazoid. And over on our website, breakfastoftheruins.com, Jan Newman dropped us a line to say, "I've not read it myself, but you guys might be interested in Tom Vague's writing about the Ladbroke Grove squatting scene in ancient days. Title was Vague 24, The West 11 Days of My Life, from 1993. You might find a copy on eBay for less than 56 quid. He's not a bad writer, but not the best journalist. His books on the Red Army faction and the Angry Brigade were fun. You guys are making my insomnia great again. Jan." Thanks for that recommendation, mate. I've had a look, and there is one copy of that available over in Tucson, Arizona, so I'll keep my eyes peeled for one perhaps closer to home. I have, however, picked up a copy of his book on the Angry Brigade, and it's now on my to-read pile. Also on the website, and again commented on our last Doctor Who episode, Darren Fletcher said, "Now then, how about doing Hot House by Brian Aldiss? Picked it up in that second-hand bookshop a few years ago, while picking up some Moorcock, The Metatemporal Detective and Winds of Limbo. Quite enjoyed it. Darren Fletcher, Normandy. I'm from St Helens, but last place I lived in UK was Bransburton. Used to shop at Kingswood, Asda, East Hull. Heard you mention you worked at HMP Hull. I was a screw at Full Sutton till 2020 and worked with some great lads who previously worked at Hull. P.S. What's the crack with patty and chips? Double spuds. Keep up the good work." Great to hear from you, Darren, and that our Venn diagrams intersect in more ways just than our taste in books. And yes, patty and chips is double spuds, but I just call that double spud magic. That said, it's also why I tend to default to a patty butty when I'm back in God's country. Now I want one. Yarks, if you're listening, we need a patty butty date ASAP. And going back to the Weird of the White Wolf episode, Jim Kirkland of Dreaming City Books said, "Your coverage of the many animal gods made me chuckle. The Gould Kimball Elric comic, Prisoner of Pantang, from Star Reach 6, fills in the gap of Elric's first visit to Pantang and first encounter with Jagreen Lern. You know what, Jim? I picked that up a year or so ago, maybe a little bit longer, and cooed at the lovely Robert Gould artwork, and then never actually read it. What a goon. Thanks for the reminder, though. And thanks as always to our patrons for keeping this show on the road. First, those without tier, Anthony Piconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster, and Sebastian Weetabix. And to our chaos engineers, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner-Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Nelbert, Ofer Ziv, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Scott Butler, and Simon Perrins, and of course our crafty Jugaderos, Alexander Harris, Christian Hundal, Eliel Westonra, Liam Turner, Loz, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Graham Holden, Toby White, and, new to the Don Blas, Sean Twist. Welcome aboard, Sean. Brute of Lashmar is making your bunk up right now. He'll also be serving up your double spud ration. He's on Jankers this week for dismissing the Carmenal of Zert as throwaway non-entities. Didn't go down well with the crew. And also, eternal thanks to our patron demons. First up, and another new traveller joining us, Jonathan Sharp. As is customary on these occasions, I dropped John a line to see whereabouts he is, what makes him tick, and he said, "Hi Andy, yours is the only podcast I come back to again and again, so it was high time I subscribed. I'm in Cumbria and a semi-regular visitor to the old pier in Morecambe and various other treasure troves dotted around the northwest and borders. I do various musics under several guises, including the Heartwood Institute. I've been a Moorcock fan since my teens, which is quite some time ago. I can't honestly remember what came first, Moorcock, Hawkwind, or RPGs. They all seem to arrive at the same time, and all have been a part of my life since. I was lucky enough to meet the man himself at a signing event at the old London Forbidden Planet on Denmark Street. He was incredibly kind to a very shy teenager and took the time to do a self-portrait in one of my books and also a personal message, Jerry's my favourite character too, which has always been the case for me. Well, thanks, mate. I'm humbled as always that you came aboard to support the show, and of course, I'm familiar with your Heartwood Institute work and have been following you on Bandcamp for a while. Listeners, I heartily recommend you check out the Heartwood Institute page. There's lots of great stuff on there, including the Quatermass-inspired Ringstone Round EP and a whole host of other releases that directly reference fucking weird, offbeat and scary Italian books from when I was a kid, and if they're not doing that, they're just haunting my brain with sounds and grooves that make me look over my shoulder for the spirit of dark and lonely water. And thanks also to Alistair Davison, Andy Clark, Andy Darby, David Lee, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, Imria, Jenny Stim, Jason Vogel, Joe Monty, Lee Gary, Mark Hebden, Marius Latauskas, Miles Reed-Labato, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tony Milazzo, the OG patron Norman Beresford, and last, but never least of course, Robert McMillan. Enough of my blather. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. BITR Breakfast in the Ruins Radio is live on Radio Garden or via the web player at breakfastintheruinsradio.blogspot.com. We have our Patreon page too. There are a few extra odds and sods on there. But for now, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.